This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Missions and Visions. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. 20 years ago, most mainstream scholars would tell you that capitalism, along with Western liberalism, was this triumphant form of government. It was quote-unquote superior. There is no alternative is a favorite quote from Margaret Thatcher, late British Prime Minister, which describes her belief that there is no better model than capitalism and that economic liberalism must push back against communism and socialism. Now, American scholar Francis Fukuyama's famous assertion of the end of history echoed Margaret Thatcher's optimism. Then came China, a gravity-defying case which sustained stellar economic growth rates and social improvement without copying Western political system wholesale. Now, the organizing principle of this stellar growth of China and this development has been encapsulated recently in what Beijing calls the whole process people's democracy and Chinese path to modernization. What do they really mean? Here with me are Associate Professor Xia Lu from the School of Marxism Studies at Renmin University. He will help walk us through these political jargons. And also here in the Beijing studio is Enoch Wang from Hong Kong, China. He's a senior advisor at Online Education and International Cooperation at Tsinghua University. We'll also be talking to Ivan Kozinets, a Russian young scholar currently majoring in international law at Ningbo University, and also his schoolmate, Aisha Zahid, a Pakistani scholar majoring in aquaculture. Now, welcome to all of you to this special program. Professor Xia, let me start with you. How would you compare and explain China's, this whole process, people's democracy? How do you think China's, Chinese-style democracy has fared, all things considered, over the past 20 years, especially if you compare it against the Western models?
Well, thank you very much for the question. In my opinion, actually, the whole process, people's democracy, may have two dimensions. First of all, this kind of Chinese democracy has, broad kind of, scale. It covers not only the election, it covers the decision making and the supervision and even the management. So that's the kind of we can understand this for the first dimension. The second dimension, actually just, speak of the real essence of democracy or the political, let's say, process. So the politics of democracy actually should be understood as a process. That means there should be a long period of development, a long period of evolution. So the China's whole process, people's democracy, does not only talk about the present time, it talks also about the future, the future goal. So we can argue that the whole process, people's democracy, really touches the essence of the political, participation or the people's political activity.
Yeah, because democracy literally means people rule,
yes,
or people rules.
Yes,
and underlying assumption is that people should be well informed, they should be well educated. And many Western scholars even admitted that the underlying principle of democracy should be a well-educated citizenry. Right.
So if we talk about the whole the whole process, people's democracy, we can also see that the Chinese version of democracy has a broad meaning more broad meaning than the Western, understanding of democracy. Because when we talk about democracy in a Western, let's say, setting or the condition, and they mainly talk about or they mainly refer to the election. And especially the national level election, or maybe the election of the members into the legislature. So they call this as a democracy. But if we talk about the government business or the government, let's say, decision making, they would call this executive or administration. So they have a very strict and narrow understanding about politics, about democracy. But here in China, we have more broad understanding about democracy and even the politics. So we consider the business in legislature and the business in executive both, or even the business in the grassroots governance level, or are the fear of politics.
Yeah, Enoch, you studied in many places, both in the Western world and here in Asia. How would you compare the Chinese-style democracy versus those of the West?
I couldn't agree more with what Professor Xia has mentioned, that I think the West focused a lot more on procedure, focused a lot more on election, as opposed in China in general, focused a lot more on results. Focus more on whether the democracy actually works in improving the standard of living of people. For example, while I was studying in China, I had opportunity to travel across different places in China. And I think one of the most well-celebrated achievement of China is lifting millions of people out of poverty. And I think it's a great result of democracy in the sense of actually improving the standard of living in a very targeted approach, in an approach that works, in an approach that is sustainable. Or for example, last year, I think a very, very well-known event is China hosting the UN Biodiversity Conference. It was a great success in improving not just standard of living in China, but also in other places in the world. And I think that's also a great example of China's path to modernization in the sense that it's moving beyond just numerical growth, but in terms of quality development as a whole in a country. I think this is a lot of different examples that we can look into in actually understanding better about the results of democracy itself.
Yeah, it's about electing or having a government that actually delivers, right? Yvonne, in Ningbo, Zhejiang, what is your understanding of the whole process, people's democracy?
Well, first of all, I want to note that it is like a very unique system in our modern world. And I see that over decades, as I also made some small researches, the electoral law of National People Congress and local people congresses have been amended progressively. And I also can't agree more with the previous speaker that in Chinese system, not the elections themselves matter, but the results. Because unfortunately, in Western countries, we can see a lot of political figures going to elections and breaking their promises right after they've been elected. Yes, right after they drink a champagne. But in China, it's different. And I see that everyone here do really cares about results. And we also see that in the whole election process, people from various structural levels can get there. So starting from community level, yes, village level, all the way up to the national level. That is really brilliant.
Aisha, what do you think? Recently, you went to a local legislature in Ningbo, right? As far as I'm understood.
In my opinion, yes, I went to the Ningbo Municipal Committee Congress, and what I observed that the democracy overall, it's the process in which the common man can also give their opinion about the legislation or law building. And what I also observed that the most democratic practices is that nowadays, China is going toward the modernization and even taking steps toward the modernizations, especially in the field of science and technology. And also they are working for the poverty reduction and stability of the country. And I think that is the result of the democratic practices that is going on in the country right now. So that's what I observed during that period when I went to visit the People Congress.
Coming from the Pakistani perspective, we understand that there are dozens of parties. Many have seats in the Pakistani parliament. It is it's a growing democracy in Pakistan. I had the pleasure of visiting your country in 2011. How would you really compare the democracy here in China versus the governance style in Pakistan?
What I want to say that democracy actually the same meaning in all over the world. But what the difference comes when there is the ruling party have different authorities and there they need to implement the laws accordingly or properly. So yes, there is a difference from country to country. Like some country maybe have good ruling parties, or they have more like intelligent people in the authority, like they are making legislation from the actual field the people are working. So basically there is a big difference in both countries' democratic values. I think so. In the field of technology or in the other fields, yes, I observe there is a big difference between both of the countries' democratic practices. Like in some countries, the ruling party give most of the, like my colleague Ivan said that they ask many things when there is the time of election, but they don't do many things what they promises with the common people. So and that's, I think that's the difference. But in my country, it's also going toward the upward right now, because most of the qualified people now coming into the government, and they are taking charge of government. So I hope so in future the democratic values in my country will also increase.
Yeah, Yvonne, you lived in China for quite a while. Specifically, what practices in your daily life that you would consider democratic by living here in China?
Well, actually, it is quite a broad term for democratic actions. I would like to share my impression, mostly by visiting the People's Congress in Ningbo municipality. So for me, like the best way to truly implement democratic, also in terms of voting in favor or against some political decisions, is to ensure that the process of voting will be mostly protected from any, from any intrusions or from any influences from other interested parties. And I see that here in People's Congress, on the example of Ningbo municipality, the voting system is anonymous. So while voting, no one can really see how to vote, and that is really nice, like psychological relief for representatives, that they can actually vote for that they really needed, not for that they've been, offered or in other way influenced to vote for. They can truly express themselves.
All right, Professor Xia, there are so many criticism alleged against the Chinese system. Like it or not, many say that China is not practicing Western-style democracy in that there's no universal suffrage, for example, every 4 or 5 years. And the media are not assuming a watchdog role as aggressively as their Western counterparts. No monitors from the EU or the United States when it comes to local elections. How would you respond to those, Western allegations?
First of all, we need to admit that different, people should have a different understanding about the real essence of politics. Politics does not only mean, to follow a certain simplified version of how to elect people, how to elect a representative from the people to the legislature. Politics means to deliver good governance to the society. We need to admit that the democracy, of course, is the common value of the mankind, of the human being. However, the path to deliver the good politics, or the path to realize the good politics, should be different, and should be, let's say, in a variety, because this world is various. So, if someone would criticize Chinese political system, is not like what Western are doing, or what Western society are processing, that means that they have only a simple or single, or we can say that very simple understanding about what is democracy, what is politics. But politics should be complicated. Politics, actually is complicated, and we should have a different version or different paths to realize the essence of politics. That means to bring the good to the society, to bring all the people into the public affair.
What do you make of the fact that there are a lot of stereotypes against the Chinese system, and especially politicians are leveraging on this to really hype up the China fear-mongering? For example, recently the United States has set up this select committee on strategic competition between the United States and the Communist Party of China. They did not say between the U.S. and China, but between the U.S. and the Chinese Communist Party. What do you make of this kind of political jargons and political phrases being used?
The elites, American elites, they have a very deep, a biased understanding about the word communism and the result of a communist movement and even the communist ideology. So we can say that when we look back to the history of the Cold War, the second half of the 20th century, right? So, not only in the journalism, but also in academic world, academic community, there was a very strong, let's say, bias understanding or
also
bias.
Pop culture, right? The Soviets are coming, the posters, the Hollywood movies, Ronald Reagan playing this, who is a commie, who's a citizen
Yes,
commercial.
Exactly. But there was a subfield in comparative politics. That was my major. A subfield in comparative politics, it is called the comparative communism studies. Okay, so in this subfield, the scholars tried or made their effort, made their attempt to introduce what the communist system was or what communist ideology would like to bring about to the society, to the people. There would be some kind of success, and they also admit that there would be some kind of failure, right? So people should know what communism is, what the communist system is, but deeply, in the American society, they have very deep bias understanding about what, they fear the communism, like they fear some kind of, bad animal or negative image or something like that. So still in the, the American politics or in the national level, they still have this kind of strong bias understanding, negative understanding of communism, and they would like to, add this kind of negative image to China, to what China is now doing, what China is now pursuing, and what CPC is now pursuing, like the whole process people's democracy. And they would like to say, okay, this is not what we understand as democracy, because they only understand democracy as elect people or elect the representative to the House or to the Senate, and then let those people decide everything. So that does not mean democracy. Democracy means that you should really let people understand or let people get involved in all the process of the political affair, public affair, not only in the election, but also in the decision making, but also in the policy implementation, also in the policy re-evaluation. So all this kind of thing, not only national level, but also the provincial, state level, and even grassroots level. So it is a whole process, and it is complicated.
Thanks for these clarifications.
Yeah.
Enoch, how would you see the form of government, be it socialism or Western-style democracy or multi-party elections, versus the effectiveness of governance? Which do you think is more important at the end of the day?
I think the West focuses on the politics of fear. And that's why they need to constantly create an enemy. In the sense that it's not actually constructive. And they rely on having an enemy to succeed. And then another word that you mentioned is competition. I think competition is good, but unhealthy competition and having competition for the sake of competition, that doesn't work. And the way that I see in China is a very collaborative approach. For example, at this moment, we're having the two sessions. One of the conference is a Chinese National Political Consultative Conference. And it's a very collaborative approach. And let's not forget, Communist Party is the ruling party, but it's not the only party that exists in China. And different parties work on a very collaborative approach, in a consultative approach, to work to progress the country, to progress development. And I think this is an approach that have worked and deliver democracy. And what I think one of the scholars mentioned, I think the West focus a lot on making promises. But the way that I see in China is about delivering promises. And I think this, I think, let's just say, let the results speak for itself. And I think for the past, in 2 years ago, we celebrated the centennial of the Communist Party. I think this is a testimonial that this system works. And as Professor Sa mentioned, it's a process. And that is, we never claim it's perfect system, but it's a system that works for this country.
You talk to so many friends from around the world. What are some of the more common questions that they have against you, when it comes to China's political system, and how would you answer them?
I think the one of the most common question is whether having a single party works and whether it self-corrects itself. Because I think the West rely on the idea that because there is different party competing against each other, that's why it's accountable. But I think we have seen, for example, in the past several years, let's take the example of the pandemic. I think we have seen in China that the reason why we have successfully, addressed the pandemic issues is because different layers from the grassroots all the way to national level, people are accountable to the promises that they made and the policies that they made. And when things don't work, people are accountable, people are hold accountable to them. And then, different people move up or down the ladder. Where in the West, we have seen, thousands and millions of people have died because of the pandemic, but yet no one is accountable to the decision that they make and the promises that they made.
Yvonne in Ningbo, let me go to you. So recently you went to this local legislature. What impressed you the most? What did you see? What did you observe?
So first of all, I observed a highly organized system. Yes, how the process is being initialized, how transparent is everything here. And I also can see, for example, on some official reports of Chinese researchers, maybe, for example, Academy of Contemporary China, to some others, and I can see a high level of transparency actually, so that every Chinese person, a Chinese citizen, knows what's going on, what results have been gained, and that is truly nice. Because for me, the greatest maybe fear is the lack of information, but I see here this fear, yes, is eliminated absolutely. So it is very nice to see this kind of transparency of results and decisions.
There is also this important concept of Chinese path to modernization. Beijing believes that the West does not monopolize the narratives when it comes to approaches, systems towards modernization. China is certainly entitled, in its opinion, to explain and elaborate on its own approach. What is your understanding of this Chinese path to modernization?
We talk about the modernization, the most important thing I am observing, you can see in the field of science and technology, most of the scientists are working like very hardly to fulfill the demands. Like me being, I am also a scientist, I'm also working for fish disease. So I'm also working in China. So at the moment, I want to appreciate all the people who are working at the moment to work for the modernization of China. Third of all, basically it's all about in the government hand. Like all the system never be perfect, but the government is making the system perfect and try their best. Last time what I observed in that meeting where we participated, that the government system is very clear and they are trying their best to make the country more modern, more civilized, and also giving the opportunity to the civil people to participate in making legislation or laws, or they are also helping them to implement.
Professor Xia, what do you think? In what ways do you think the Chinese approach can be maybe shared and learned by other parts of the world?
Well, when we talk about modernization and Chinese style of modernization, we should admit that there are some kind of similarities between the Chinese version of modernization and the general understanding of modernization. However, there also be some there are also some kind of difference. Well, we talk about the similarity first. Modernization, of course, means the improvement of infrastructure, improvement of people's livelihood, and the more and more convenience of people's livelihood. That is the modernization, and even urbanization, and even the increase of literacy. However, Chinese version of modernization is more concerned about the effect, especially the side effect of the modernization. That is the modernity. So this kind of modernity, one of the dimension of the modernity is the sharp contrast between the have and have not, the poor and the rich. So in the first place, when China launched the Chinese version of modernization, it says clearly in the the 20th national, the report of the 20th Party Congress said that China should not go to that kind of old path of modernization. That is more and more sharp and sharp kind of contrast between the rich and the poor. And also Chinese modernization focus more on the balance between the socio-economic development and the nature and the ecological reserve. So this is a kind of Chinese this result from Chinese traditional philosophy. Like if you consider if you consider the consequence of this process, and there goes the success. If you do not consider the consequence, there goes the failure. So that's the Chinese traditional philosophy, and we can say that this is what the rest of the world can learn from Chinese version of modernization, is a systematic thinking about the social development.
Yeah. But the government doesn't want to be too heavy-handed, because there's a fine line between making sure that this is an equal society, it's a fair one, versus one that is egalitarian, that China saw over the past decades in the 50s and 60s, where the results were made equal, whereby there are different instincts, there are different talents, there are different inspirations and incentives out there.
So that is why, when we talk about the Chinese modernization or the Chinese version of modernization, the party and the government still focus on, the development development is the first priority. First, we need to develop. First, we need to have some kind of economic growth and the improvement of the GDP and the improvement of the GDP per capita. So first let people have, and then to solve the question, of the social inequality or the social, gap, this kind of thing. So that's why Chinese version of modernization is a complicated project. It encompasses a lot of things, not only about economic growth, but also about the social development, social equality, this kind of thing.
Yeah, Enoch, anything to add? What do you think?
I cannot agree more. Right? Common prosperity is a very core part of
Yeah.
Chinese path to modernization. But also one thing I think worth mentioning, 10 years ago in 2013, that was when it was first brought up the idea of Belt and Road Initiative. So we will celebrate a decade long of this achievement. And that was also a time when it was brought up the idea of global community of a shared future. So recently, the Belarusian president visited China, and one of the key milestone or project on that Belt and Road is the China-Belarus Industrial Park, the Great Stone. And talking about investment in high tech, and I think the industrial park is a great example of investment of high tech manufacture, across the whole entire Belt and Road initiative. I think this would drive growth, not just development, not just in China, Belarus, but also across the whole entire Belt and Road and the developing country, as you mentioned. I think that's a very, very important part. Another thing which is worth mentioning is this peaceful resolution and peaceful path to modernization. And I think this is a very, very important path that China has chose to take. And it's a very, very distinction between, I think, China path and the Western path to modernization. I think last but not least, I think we have seen tremendous investment, whether it's from climate change to biodiversity. I think that's also another special characteristic of China path to modernization is the coexistence between human and nature. That's another special characteristic of China's path to modernization.
Yeah, talking about China's strategy worldwide, many still assert that China is this aggressive power, or somehow that is the narrative by Western mainstream media, like it or not.
So I think, again, I'll go back to, I think the whole entire idea of Belt and Road Initiative. It's not about, having everyone contributing towards China growth. It's about creating this global community of shared future. It's about creating a community where all the developing countries can develop together. And China is playing a leading role in this, but it's not the role that is drawing all the resources from the rest of the developing world.
Yeah. All right, Yvonne, Aisha, thank you both so very much. Take care. And Enoch, Professor Xia, thank you both very much. And that will do it for this edition of Missions and Visions. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. I'll see you again next time.